I don't think so. I don't think so.
En la ciencia.
I don't think that's a relevant question because our students.
Perfect.
I don't think so. This is about our lives. This is about American lives. And it should not be partisan. Science should not be partisan.
At some point, the daily drumbeat of depression and terror veers into panic porn. FDR said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And I think the question is,
News sources have to rein it in.
I'll be honest with you. I'm kind of retarded.
We need the news to calm down and treat us like adults.
Perfect. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining me again and welcome back. This is a true honor because we have an authority that we can all, before this, it's usually just laymen speaking on social issues and just kind of having a discourse. But now we have an authority that we can truly trust and take credence with. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my favorite professor from law school and somebody that I truly took a lot of education and growth from, and I appreciate Professor Michael Dimino. Thank you so much for joining me, Professor.
Thanks, Alexander. It's a pleasure, despite the over-the-top introduction. I'm sure that I'm not all worthy of it, but thank you for having me on.
Oh, I couldn't be more thankful myself. And so, Professor, kind of to start the conversation off, before I get into any questions, we'd like to get a little bit of a background of, you and your journey through becoming a law school student, then graduating, becoming a professor, and kind of what led you to where you're at today.
Sure. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I graduated from college. I went to the State University of New York at Buffalo. I graduated college in 1998 and then went to the Harvard Law School, graduated there in 2001. I was fortunate enough to clerk for 3 different judges. I started for Judge Rosenblatt on the New York Court of Appeals, and then Judge Silberman on the DC Circuit and Judge Friedman on the DC District. And at the conclusion of that clerkship, I began teaching at what is now known as the Widener Commonwealth Law School. And so I've held a faculty position there since 2004. And in those intervening 16 years or so, I've been fortunate to have visiting professorships at other places. I've taught at Stetson, I've taught at Florida State, I've taught at the University of South Carolina, and I've taught at Penn State. And then I was also a Fulbright scholar, so I taught at a school in Rome in the spring semester of 2018. But my permanent position is at Widener. That's where I am now. That's where I was able to meet you. And so that's how we know each other.
So I have to ask, Professor, what was it like teaching in Italy? What was the academic room like? What was the focus of the students and kind of just was the approach to education different? I'd imagine. What kind of differences did you experience?
The most fortunate aspect of it all was that the students spoke English. So even though I speak a little bit of Italian, I don't speak it nearly well enough to teach in Italian. And so the classroom was in English, although they helped me out with my a little bit. But substantively on the law, they were not all law students. Some of them were interested in going into the law, but they weren't law students. Instead, their focus tended to be in international relations. So they wanted the perspective of an American because some of them foresaw careers in America or careers that would involve them in doing business with Americans. And so they wanted to learn more about the United States. And I taught 2 different courses when I was there. One of them about US law and foreign policy, and another about comparative elections. And it was a fascinating time to do it because, as I said, it was the spring of 2018. Our 2016 election was still recent. And right after I arrived, the Italians had their national election.
Oh, wow.
Which also involved a somewhat surprisingly good showing from some populist parties that they have there. And so we were able to talk about developments in politics across nations, and also able to talk comparing our different electoral systems. What was the American two-party system as opposed to the Italian and other European continental systems that tend to be much more accepting of multiple smaller parties. And so we talked about the ways that electoral laws shape politics, not simply the other way around as it's usually thought about.
Wow. And we're literally living that right now. I mean, that is a struggle that we're trying to so before we get into the weeds of kind of the substance I wanted to talk to you about, while we're still talking about just education in general, how has it been for you adapting? Because I know I made a comment before the podcast, kind of like lightheartedly, like you were never going to get me to focus on Zoom my last semester of law school. But in some reality, when we have a bunch of little kids in our neighborhood that are going to grade school. And when we would, have neighborhood talks and such about how they're going to public school and how every school's got their own approach, either some on Zoom only, some in this building, some hybrid between the two. And our school seems to be doing a hybrid right now. And I would always say that I was at the highest level of education in theory. And I could tell you for a fact, and part of it could be my fault as well, but I could tell you everyone else around me experienced the same thing, where it being on Zoom, me in my pajamas in my living room, just rolling out of bed, and kind of the lackadaisical, I'm talking to a screen. I know for sure I got half out of it what I could have had it been in person. But I also understand that now that this is the new normal, and this is kind of where we're growing towards, that we've adapted and it's become more substantive and we can get more out of it as well. So through this evolution, I know being thrown into it at first, halfway through a semester, it was a whirlwind for everybody. But now actually starting a new school year, there's new students now in the building. Well, the theoretical building, and now we're trying to introduce new people to this way of law, but then also we're trying to introduce the teachers to this new way of teaching. How did that kind of adaptation come to you? Is it easy or hard, and how are you dealing with teaching over Zoom?
I don't think very many people would tell you that teaching over Zoom is as effective as teaching in the classroom. Now, that said, there are some advantages. I've gotten in sometimes better attendance online than in the classroom, because people who are sick, even with non-COVID related diseases, people who have a regular cold would not be able to go into school but still attend class when the class is online. Same sort of thing for people who have childcare obligations or people who have other kinds of things going on in their lives, which is common for law students, particular students going as adult and evening pro after they get done with their regular 9-to-5 jobs. So in that respect, there really is an advantage to going online, even if, as you say, it's rather hard to concentrate when you're just watching a screen instead of being in a classroom. But one thing that's different, I think, for me than for the grade school kids that you mentioned in the question is that by and large, the students who go to law school are, of course, older than grade school kids, and they choose law school as a step toward a career that they want. And therefore, they have a kind of drive, even if it's hard for them to concentrate just because it's easier to be distracted and you got your spouse is nearby, your kids are running around, you got the refrigerator there, you got the other things that can distract you from the class. Still, you're there for a reason. Nobody's forcing you to be in law school. You're there because you want to be there and you want to get the education that we're trying to provide. So even though we have to overcome some of those kinds of distractions, still, at least we have the students who understand that if they don't pay attention, really, it's their loss. And I don't think that, I certainly don't think elementary school students approach it in the same kind of way. And so I think the problems of keeping them focused are going to be more of a concern than I face when I'm teaching people who most of the time are in their mid-20s.
That's a really strong answer. I think you made some really great points. What's interesting is, you made that comparison to the younger generation, people in grade school. What I think about it all the time, and my mom she watches this all the time, and she's gonna cringe hearing this, but I've told myself so often following college that I would give anything to go back at 27, not at 20, to go back and retake a lot of my not the elective classes, but there were some philosophy or political science courses that I read half the amount that I would have had I, like you said, when you go into law school, there was a switch that, something switched on, and now you became a professional academic where now I'm taking this serious. This is my mission. This is my goal. Whereas, while I was 20 years old, my mission and my goal was I was still maturing. I was still, distracted by the girls and the fun that is college, right? And so for me, I am disappointed that I feel like college, I think, would be more fruitful. And I think this is more of a personal issue, but maybe if it was a little later in life, because college for me was more growth and maturing in personally than I did academically. And I know for other people it was different. They were in their dorms 100% taking like a job, and that's why they walked into, a scholarship that I didn't have. But also, I thought part of my problem was maturity. And I think you raise a really great point that with the younger generation, I don't know, talking with these kids, when they go to school and they go to the building, they got rid of, this is a 9-year-old girl telling me, yeah, but we do have a little bit of a recess, but we're all got to stay away from each other. And we got rid of music class, art class, and gym class. And I'm like, what are you going to school for? I mean, that is literally it. The socialization of children. Billy's mean. He's a bully. Susie treats me nice. Like, that socialization aspect is really what you're there for versus the academics itself. And I don't know how you supplement that or recreate it, especially virtually.
I worry about that too. I think that even without the problems associated with the pandemic, the nature of the human condition is always that when you have the time and the energy and the good health of youth, you don't have the wisdom to use that time and energy and good health the way that you would if you would once you matured. And it's I don't think that you're the only one at all who goes by a couple of years and then looks back and says, "Boy, if I had to do that over again, I'd do something different." I think that we all do, and the people who make the most of youth go through it with a kind of long-term plan, and I guess that's a kind of wisdom, a precocious kind of wisdom, that if you can live your youth the way that you like to when you were older, or if you listen to the people who are older and take their advice and say, when other people say, "Boy, if I had to do it over again, here's what I do," and pay attention to that, then you're apt to get the benefit of that kind of wisdom.
So I got to ask you, Professor, because one thing I've also noticed, I laugh all the time. Before law school, I had this math teacher, my senior year geometry teacher, who left an impact. And there were very few of them that did that. But before we get to one of the questions I'd like to pry on you, did you always know you wanted to be an educator?
I didn't know for certain. I've always known, I've had an attraction to teaching even before I went to law school. My mother was an elementary school teacher, and so I had looked up to her as an educator and looked up to the profession of education as something admirable and something that I might want to get into. But I hadn't locked into that myself until I was in law school. And then I saw the way that law school classes taught differently from from classes in my undergraduate education. And I said, boy, this is fun. I like being a law student, and I would like it even more if I was the one who was running the class, if it was me doing the educating, if I became expert in these subject areas, and it was my privilege to be able to bring this education to the students, that I would like that even more. And so from that time, sort of the end of my first year of law school up since then, I tried to focus on what would position me well for getting into teaching. So I knew that I had to try to write something and get something published and get a clerkship with a judge and move in that direction. And so I did what I could do, and I got lucky and got clerkships with great judges. And then I went on the teaching market, and Widener wanted to hire someone who was interested in teaching the subjects that I was interested in teaching. And we happened to click, and they offered me the job, and I got it, which is remarkable, just given the odds that there are a ton of people who want to go into law teaching and not a lot of jobs who are open, that are open. But I managed to make that connection, and I've been very happy with the ability to teach some really fascinating subjects, in particular constitutional law and election law, First Amendment, free speech, all the kinds of subjects that appear in the newspapers all the time and that are really the most fun to talk about. I get to talk about for a living.
That's so that is fantastic, and I really love that. So I have to ask, Professor, with the academic environment that compelled you to take on this endeavor, and really compelled you to dedicate your life to it, do you believe, or have you noticed, does it seem as if that classroom environment that compelled you, is it the same classroom environment we have today? And I know I have in the past kind of expressed my opinion of how I feel like free thought in an academic classroom is just stifled. And I know that is, but that's why I appreciated your classes, because your classes were a glimmer of what college was created for 100 years ago. That we're here, guys, to there's some bad ideas, and I welcome them, because that's how the good ideas surface to the top. So I guess, re-emphasizing my question, is this environment the same as the environment that compelled you, or do you feel a dynamic, I don't know, this dynamic kind of pulling you from what compelled you to this kind of track we're heading down?
There's always going to be some differences. It's been 20 years since, or about 20 years since I graduated from law school, and the world changes, legal education changes, there are going to be some changes, the law changes. But fundamentally, the most important lesson for a law professor to impart to the students is the same now as it always has been. And that is the skill in arguing both sides of a case. So what my chief objective, now, of course, I have other objectives. I want to make sure that you understand what we call black letter law, the basics of what the law is. I want to make sure you know what major cases have held. I want to make sure you can pass the bar exam and all those kinds of things. But the chief skill of being a lawyer is to be able to say, here is the raw material we have to work with. Here's a statute, here's a bunch of cases. Now, client walks into your office and presents you with the following issue. Can you argue it? Can you argue that client's case effectively? Now, can you argue the other side's case effectively? And good lawyers can, of course, good lawyers do both. Good lawyers have to use the tools that they have and to know what kinds of arguments they can make and what the potential counter arguments to it are. And you and I talked, I think, right around the time of your graduation, we had a conversation about the way that I run classes. And you were saying how the students have to try to, or the students just like to have fun thinking, well, what does this professor really think? And the answer, as it appeared from the class, was that whatever I think, what the opinion that I hold is whatever the opposite is of what the students said. because my goal is to challenge the student, to make sure the student appreciates the weak points of his argument, because if he doesn't, then he's going to be surprised and unprepared when opposing counsel comes in and points out the weak parts of his argument. So that's what I tried to do, and that's the same thing I experienced. It's the same thing that other law professors try to impart to the students. It's this ability to make arguments in part by understanding what the likely arguments, the pluses and minuses, are going to be on both sides of any open issue of law.
So with such a strong answer, Professor, I have to ask, it seems, I could be misguided, but it seems like students today, or society today, people have significantly more blind convictions in their opinions of just like, whereas a good lawyer, a good debater, because for me, I did states and nationals in debate. That's what provoked me into going into law. So I was like, if I could get paid to do what I love to do on my Saturdays, then I would love this. And so for me, when I was 15, I was spending my Saturdays after a football game teaching myself how I'd have to have a case for both sides of the argument. So that's a part of my chemistry now at this point. But I also felt I'm sitting in a classroom where people were just so convicted by their opinions, where you would just the mental exercise, professor, throws out there a particular thought experiment and I support it or negate it. It's not that is my personal opinion. It's that I'm trying to exercise exactly what you said we're trying to teach. And it felt like in the classroom, we had kids that weren't even going to want to take on the exercise of trying to not even understand the other perspective, but try to argue it or find ways to even support it if they had to. Do you feel as if the classroom is more dictated by these blind convictions, or is it just people are more passionate and people have not lost the ability to argue both sides? It's just kind of, hey man, you just felt roughed up by people who had other opinions.
I think the best students are going to appreciate both sides, and even if they don't, even if they understand there's a clear winner, and most of us, most law students, most law professors, lawyers, most people have come to a conclusion about which side is better. But the best law students are going to be able to say, regardless of my opinions, I'm going to be able to argue the other side. And so sometimes what some professors will do is they'll call on a student to present the argument against the side that the professor knows that student really believes. So what do you think? Well, I think that this case should come out in favor of the plaintiff. All right, well, now you're representing the defendant. What's the best argument that you can bring? And that sends the implicit lesson that you can't always pick your clients, that you're going to be working for a firm or you're going to be working in an agency, and here's the position. You need to be able to be an in-depth thinker enough to come to your own conclusions about what the law should be. But sometimes when you're an advocate, your job is not to argue for what you think the law should be. It's for what your client thinks the law should be.
Right.
And that's just part of the job. But in some circumstances, it's an unfortunate part of the job. It's one of the reasons why I like being in academia rather than being a practicing lawyer, that I like the idea that my job is to figure out what the law should be and to write articles where I advocate for bringing the law in a direction that I think is the right one, as opposed to the one favored by the person who's paying my bills. But not a lot of people are going to have the advantage of being in my position. Most of the people are going to be paid by clients who want their lawyers to advocate for them, and where the legal ethics require the lawyer to advocate for the client. So while yes, you were in the classroom more recently than I was as a student, and so if you tell me that the students' learning was interrupted because of the ideological convictions that they bring into the class, then I believe you. Certainly, I know that's true for some of the students, but I hope that for most of the students, they appreciate that we're all going to come in with ideological convictions, But when we're acting in a professional capacity, we can't let those ideological convictions drive our professional behavior.
No, I think that's a really great point. And the strongest part to hammer that point home was I don't think as much the classroom environment was the disruption as much as just adults acting childish outside of the classroom, where your point you made in class followed you outside the classroom, and now, people just can't let it go. So I think you make a really great point that you get out of it what you put into it. So if you're sitting in that 2-hour classroom during that 2-hour period and you're actually exercising your thoughts and you're trying to grow, then you're going to get that growth out of it. And I could say for sure I definitely did. And I know I don't think you can sit in that room and just coast through. Like you said, the system is made to have those that sink to the bottom fall through. And it inevitably, all those that are there at the end of the race are there because they put in the effort required. So I do agree with you just significantly for the most part, but I think if anything, it was distractions outside of it, which is on us. That's the students, and that comes with the territory of a stressful environment. But Professor, one question I have for you before we really get into the social weeds is, it just in general, this is a vague, open question, just kind of see how you interpret it. But as you have spent such a long career just entrenching yourself in the Constitution and being so well in depth with just the length and depth it goes into, is there any part where you feel the forefathers just nailed it? The solution then is still a solution now, and anywhere they just really nailed the mark?
I think that their fundamental insight into human nature and democratic theory is as relevant today as it was then. I think it's timeless. I think it's that the way to achieve liberty is to divide power. That the concentration of power, and this is not brand new with the framers. Montesquieu, the political philosopher, was the one who most famously made this at the time of the framing. It's his Montesquieu's spirit of the laws was relied on extensively by the framers. But that the insight is that if you concentrate power in any group, it doesn't have to be a king, but it can be a legislature. It can be whatever kind of governmental organization you want, that you can design what you think is the most perfect structure for governing. If you concentrate all power there, that's going to be a recipe for tyranny. And the way to keep power from spiraling out of control is to make sure that those institutions of power have to share power with other institutions. Now, the details about how they do that, how we should select this branch of government, what the powers of that branch of government should be, you can quibble over that. But the fundamental insight that we need to divide power between a judiciary and a legislature and an executive branch, and even that we can divide power between national and state governments, that's a major improvement over the governmental structures that existed to that point. And then I have only the highest regard for the framers, so there's a very great deal about the Constitution that I admire tremendously, and any attempt to pick out just a couple of their insights is going to leave a tremendous amount out. But let me raise one other thing, at least.
Please.
The idea of a written constitution. That it seems we gloss over that concept now because we're so used to it. We think of a constitution as almost requiring it to be written down, but that wasn't what the past practice was. There wasn't a written constitution in Rome. The Roman constitution was just a bunch of norms that sort of people got used to following until they decided not to follow them anymore. and then you had a revolution. And in England, we had the English Constitution is not written down. We have a kind of principle of parliamentary supremacy, and we have these ways of doing things, ways of governing, but you don't have a written constitution. America broke from that tradition and established a written constitution, and I think that was a fundamentally brilliant idea. As Chief Justice Marshall said in Marbury versus Madison, said the reason why we write a constitution down is to establish limits on government and to make sure that those limits are not forgotten. And if you want a constitution to govern society, if you want a constitution to craft the government for a society, and you want that society to be one that protects liberty, you're going to want a constitution that limits the government and that provides a structure for making sure that those limits are followed. Part of that structure is the separation of powers. Part of it is federalism, but part of it is in writing the Constitution down so that we can always go back to the document and say, the framers gave us these guarantees. And if we don't have them anymore, if the government has taken away these liberties that the framers guaranteed to us, now we've got a problem. Now our rulers are exceeding their lawful authority because they're exercising powers that the framers didn't give to them.
Wow. Now that's fascinating. And I think that's where we as a populace fall short. I mean, that is so significant. We take it for granted. And I don't think anybody ever really thought of it in that, just the significance of having it written down. So another question, kind of flipping it the other way, is there any part of the Constitution that really bugs you, that just doesn't sit right with you, or where they totally miss the mark?
Yeah, the best example, I suppose, of the error of the original Constitution was the one that was corrected by the 12th Amendment. The original constitutional design for picking the president and vice president said, we'll take this electoral college, they'll vote for who they think should be president, and the one who gets the most votes will be president, the one who gets the second most votes will be vice president. Well, they didn't foresee the development of political parties. So in the election of 1796, Adams gets the most votes, he becomes president. The second most votes goes to Jefferson, who's Adams's political adversary. So you don't have a president and vice president who work together. If it happened to be the case that Adams were to die in office or leave before his term was expired, his place would be taken by someone with very different political attitudes in the middle of a term. And I think that pretty much the entire country realized fairly early on that was a significant mistake that the framers had made. Now, that's political. Sure, that's non-controversial. Of course, there were other kinds of things where we look back and we say, boy, the Constitution would have been better if it had been written in a different way or with different kinds of provisions. Slavery being the most obvious example, that the country would have been better off for sure if slavery was outlawed by the original Constitution. If Civil War may not have been necessary at all, certainly it would have changed American history, very likely for the much better if slavery had been gotten rid of in the end of the 18th century. The counter argument to that is that if the framers had insisted, or the Northern framers had insisted on getting rid of slavery when the Constitution was written, then the South wouldn't have signed up, wouldn't have agreed to join the Constitution. The Constitution wouldn't have gotten off the ground. And so the continuing the institution of slavery, the price that the country had to pay for having a unified country under the Constitution. But certainly looking back, that seems to be one of those, at best, a tragic consequence of of the political compromises that were necessary to get the Constitution off the ground.
So that was a really great answer, Professor. And so I'm curious, I never really thought about the significance of the 12th Amendment. And, it seems like, again, this is the philosophy education in my background coming through, but there seems to be two different kind of theoretical ideas combating each other here, where one, I feel like, again, 2020 looking at it, you go, we are being ripped in half like a piece of paper, and we are two countries living in one. And it is so clear the toxic outcome that comes from bipartisanship that the same forefathers, they foresaw this being a problem, that we probably should try to avoid bipartisanship. And so I think what's great is, at first I'm like, my knee-jerk reaction is like, wow, that sounds pretty great. Maybe it sucks for you blue and red, but maybe we need to make a little purple here and learn how to cooperate with each other. But then on the other side, the utilitarian in me goes, well, you could never do that. To exactly your point, as you raise, that you would have the majority of the country vote in one person, and if they were to pass away or whatever were to happen, now the second person to come in is not the ideological perspective of the majority. And so it's kind of like this utilitarian concept combating my disdain for bipartisanship. I feel like a lot of the lack of community and kind of our social political problems we're facing right now is this manufactured ideological war through bipartisanship. So I think it's just, I don't know. I'm trying to form it in a question to provoke more, but I guess for me, it's like, how do we combat bipartisanship where we're at right now when clearly something like that we can't do? We can't try to make you guys work together, even though that would it would promote good practices. You would leave half this country, the majority of this country, left out to dry when, the person they chose isn't there any longer. But how do we approach bringing community back to our society?
One of the framers' answers to that would have been federalism, that by leaving most of the political choices for a society to the states, you allow different states to have very different interests and very different kinds of policies. So New York does not have to have the same kind of elected officials and the same kind of policies as Pennsylvania, as West Virginia, as Utah, as Hawaii. That there can be differences because we elect different people in those different communities. Now, the fundamental tension in American federalism is that we have those state-by-state kinds of decisions, but the states are still within one union, and the decisions, the laws of the national government, according to the Constitution, are supreme over those of the states. And so we have both of those tensions. We're being pulled in opposite directions, kind of as you said, that we have these, we have this identity of ourselves tied up with our states. We see ourselves as citizens of Ohio or Pennsylvania or wherever. And we want to create a community that works for the people there. On the other hand, we also see ourselves as Americans, and we think that in some respects, we should have rights that are rights or ways of doing things, whatever it is you were talking about, that there should be some political choices that don't depend on where you live. That as long as you are in the United States, you should, for example, be guaranteed the freedom of speech and the freedom to worship whatever God you want. And that shouldn't depend on what side of some state border you are. And so we have this same fundamental tension that we've had since federalism was established in the Constitution between the ability to legislate policies on a state-by-state basis and the commitment that being American should guarantee you certain kinds of rights or certain kinds of policies.
That, I think, really hammers home the point. I know I brought this. This is totally off, and we could just keep it short. But I've brought it up in a couple podcasts before, and I know that I mentioned it to you, where I feel as if a lot of the problems we face right now, coming on a new election, where the person who is one presidential candidate didn't necessarily win the primaries, and then furthermore, there were people left out from the primaries that weren't even allowed to be taken serious, like Tulsi Gabbard. So when you look at a system that it just seems like a layman citizen doesn't get to really have the effect that the forefathers hoped for in this representative republic, I feel like super PACs and corporations that are able to give unlimited amounts of money have superseded what this petty little civilian can only give $2,500. Why would you ever take the time to come speak to me or try to understand and make a connection with me in Ohio when Marlboro's going to foot the bill for my $50 million I need to have to run as a president? So I know I just want to get your quick thoughts on, because we've talked about it with past guests. I would love to eliminate corporations and big companies from allowing, and specifically super PACs, from having the ability to give unlimited amounts of money or just deep pockets to politicians, and give everybody a stipend of like $50 or $100. And now you don't just focus on a swing state. You have to go and make connections. And maybe we don't have the bar be $50 million to be a candidate. Maybe in a tribe of 50 states, we have maybe we look like Sweden, which is the size of like New Jersey, and we have 12 candidates. Go figure. Or we just have more than 2. And so how do you feel about, maybe, do you think it would help the community and fight this bipartisan battle we have if we had more candidates available to us, and also if they had to come to the citizens for their campaign funding? Would that have the effect we would desire, or is it just wishful thinking that would not probably bring about the desired result?
I think when we consider what to do with our campaigns, we have to try to predict what the outcome would be given any kind of change. So there are a lot of people who are frustrated with the situation that you describe, who see themselves as, see politicians as not really paying attention to them, and see politicians focused on big people or moneyed interests or whatever. But I'm skeptical that if we did more to eliminate, put this in quotation marks, the big money in politics, that if we did more to eliminate that, would we really see the rise of people who are political outsiders, who are unconnected with the political influence, who are unconnected with money or those kinds of things? I'm skeptical of that, because I think that if we take money out, and just theoretically, there's some kind of way of taking money out, whatever you think that means. If we do it, well, who's going to get the attention then? Well, it's going to be the people that you already know about, people who are celebrities, people who have achieved some amount of fame, or people who have money themselves, people who are known in the business world or in the gossip columns or whatever. You're not going to get everyday people who are going to. The fact of the matter is that if you're not connected and you don't have money and you're not politically active, then your chances of running for Congress and being successful are not good. And your chances of being influential, if you're if you aren't politically active, is not good. But the way that we have things now, you have opportunities for exerting influence even without being able to spend a tremendous amount of money. You can become active in a political party or an interest group and have your voice heard that kind of way. But there's one other thing that I wanted to mention. I know you wanted to keep the answer to this kind of short, but I think it's important for people to understand what our system now does. And there is this widespread perception that corporations, as you say, super PACs, and these that they contribute so much money into the electoral process that they're drowning out others, or whatever the negative effect is. Corporations have been banned from making direct contributions to candidates for more than 100 years. The ban in federal elections, the ban was imposed in 1907 and is still in effect. What the Citizens United decision did, and other decisions in that line did, is that they allowed corporations and interest groups like Citizens United to spend money advocating, through speech, advocating political opinions. So Citizens United and other kinds of corporations now can take out a billboard or take out an advertisement and try to convince the public that their political opinions are right. And if we really don't believe in that, I know a lot of people are attracted to the idea of getting money out of politics, and particularly getting corporations out of politics. But if we really want to stop corporations from spending money that might influence an election, again, we're talking about contributions to candidates. We're talking about money spent on speech to influence an election. If we really think that's bad, are we really comfortable saying to the NRA or the ACLU, you can't advertise? That the NRA can't take out an advertisement saying, protect your Second Amendment rights? That the ACLU can't take out an advertisement saying that individual liberties are at issue in this election? Do we really want to say to, say, some publisher, some book publisher, magazine publisher, those are all corporations, do we really want to tell them, hey, you can't publish your magazine this month because you're discussing the election, or you're discussing an issue that people are going to care about in this election, or you're talking about a candidate, so you can't use your corporate money to produce this magazine? I'd be scared about an interpretation of the First Amendment that would allow the government to shut down all of those forms of communication simply because we say, well, we don't want to take the risk that this corporation is going to influence an election.
So, Professor, that you raise an extremely interesting point. Do you believe and again, my strongest grade was First Amendment. There is nothing I'm more passionate about. That was for sure my favorite class. Now, you raise an extremely interesting point. The world evolves, as you pointed out, over the course of 20 years. Of course, things were going to change, right? And so what's really interesting, though, is, am I going to say the NRA shouldn't have a billboard? Of course not. Should Planned Parenthood have a little blurb in a magazine? Sure. But we are now on the onslaught of a new time. Something is changing, and we are no longer talking about billboards. When we sit here and waste 4 years talking about how China chose our president, or Russia chose our president, I apologize, then we need to really acknowledge what these advertisements have morphed into. I don't know if you've had a chance yet, but there is this thing on that new program on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. It's fascinating.
I have seen that one, yeah.
Boom. Okay. So what did we do? We took engineers that are coding, aficionados, these computer, geniuses, and then we put them back into school to become psychologists. And now they're doctors who are coders. And so they have dual degrees. These guys are geniuses, and we're incorporating the manipulation of your biology into these promotions and advertisements. And so now when I take a video and spend $40 on Facebook to promote my video, I can give it specific demographics. Male, in this location, I don't, because I'm trying to reach as many, the variety I can across the different varieties, but you can be so specific. And if you're, what's a company, the fact that they have a geographical documentation and record of everywhere you go, how you spend your day, what your habits are, and then we're incorporating just the triggering and manipulation of your biology into the operation of these mediums. It seems like it's no longer a page in a magazine I could just see and flip past or drive past the billboard. It is now trying to manipulate my actions. And so advertisements have become so sophisticated that maybe we need to classify. There needs to be a distinction in types of advertisements. What do you feel about that in the scope of the First Amendment? Are all advertisements the same?
Well, certainly some are not as effective as others, but the point of all of them is to influence behavior. That's why someone spends money, whether it's money spent on an advertisement to try to convince someone to buy a certain brand of laundry detergent or to vote for a particular candidate. The objective is always change people's behavior by going through the person's mind, get the person to think, it's going to help me to act in this kind of way. So, but there's, can we draw distinctions based on certain? Well, yes, and I don't mean to discount the possibility that some kinds of lines could be drawn that either would be constitutional or would be good policy or whatever. But when we consider those kinds of rules, it's important to bear in mind, I think, who it is who's going to be drawing the lines. So if the fundamental goal of the First Amendment is a kind of suspicion of the motives of the government, that we don't want the government deciding what truth is, we don't want the government deciding who has spoken enough about an issue, we don't want the government deciding that it's good to promote this opinion and bad to promote this opinion. Well, and I think it is. I think that is the fundamental goal of the First Amendment, is to take the government out of making many of those kinds of decisions. Then that makes me really nervous to give the government the power to say, oh, this form of advertisement is too powerful. This is likely to connect with too many people. This is likely to be too influential. This is going to change too many votes. We have to stop people from seeing this message because they might vote in a way that we don't want if they see this message. So we're going to approve only these other messages that say things that we're comfortable with. I think that that's a very dangerous notion, even though I don't doubt the motives of the people who are promoting that now. I don't think that the people who want there to be greater control over media are Stalinists or anything like that. I don't think that their intention is to establish some kind of totalitarian state where it's only okay to think in certain kind of terms. I don't cast aspersions on their motives that kind of way, but I still am very nervous about giving the government the power to decide what speech is okay and what speech isn't, who's spoken enough and who needs extra help. I think that the First Amendment's general libertarianism about speech, government doesn't get involved, the people can speak for themselves, let the people decide what speech is worthy of support and which isn't. I think that that's a far healthier approach in the long term.
I think you have a great point. When I was in law school, the perspective I approached the entire experience with was, and I not even consciously, but it just ended up being this libertarian type lens of civilian versus the government. Well, no. The government needs to be able to do this to protect the civilians. But then also, no, but the civilians need to have these types of rights to secure their, just to have security against the government. So I always had that perspective. What's interesting, kind of just to poke kind of to break away from the legal perspective a little bit and just have the social perspective. What is interesting, though, having this libertarian type perspective of, we need to have security against the government's the concern. But what's become interesting in 2020 in this new world we're in is it's been this whole life of watch out for the government, don't become Big Brother, this better not become some Orwellian book we live in. But then also, the new government isn't the government anymore. The new government is slowly becoming corporations where, you know, I made a video. I'm sorry. All I said was, we shouldn't have two national anthems. And sorry, folks, we need to have one national anthem for one country. That's the quickest way to divide us. And my dad was like, you shouldn't post that. And we had this long talk, and after showing a whole bunch of people, and they're like, I love it. That was the greatest video I've ever seen. Don't post it. The fact that I have to worry, so now we've lost our freedom. That First Amendment we're fighting for, just the fact that I should be able to stand in my cul-de-sac and go, guys, we shouldn't have two national anthems, and my neighbor should go, we should. The first national anthem has its problems, or whatever perspective, and then we just go shake hands and leave. When we look at the manifest destiny, what made this country what it wasn't just, hey, we don't like Britain anymore. It was the creation of the newspaper at the exact same time as the creation of coffee shops. So now it didn't matter what was being said in that newspaper. It was the fact that people had a meeting place and had ideas and topics to talk about, and that's where growth came. So what's weird is I 100% agree with you. We need to worry about the government, but what's becoming the new government seems to be corporations. Corporations go, well, no, look at what you said when you were 17, or, and what and now they're dictating social norms, kind of like Rome. We don't have, the Constitution is now what all the companies say. You'll have your livelihood and be hired to act and think in a certain way. So do you think, maybe this is misguided, or do you think maybe that is still kind of a concern that the new government is becoming corporations? What are your thoughts on all that?
That's certainly been part of the debate, and I think it's taken off more in the last couple of decades, but it's not that recent. That decades before that, there was this concern that exactly as you say, that the framers' original libertarian kind of conception of government, that the way to achieve liberty was to limit government, has led to a kind of tyranny of big business. The argument goes like this: that just as the framing generation felt that it was under the thumb of King George, that we now feel like we're under the thumb of Amazon or Microsoft or Ford or whatever. The argument goes a step further than that, and it says, well, if we have to choose which of these institutions to have more faith in, isn't it better to put faith in government, because we can elect people who influence government, and government is in place to do what's best for us, or at least for the voters, as compared to the power of corporations, that the people who are in leadership positions in corporations are driven by the profit motive. They want to make more money for the shareholders, which may not be the same beneficial positions for the average American or the average voter. I think that that's a lot of what drives some of the attitude on the political left now. Obviously, that is controversial, but it's not brand new. Those kinds of debates have played out before. The other side to that is that that's still part of this same kind of concern that you and I were talking about just a couple of minutes ago, that if the government decides that, hey, this corporation is getting too powerful, we need to restrict this corporation for the benefit of the public. And not just we need to limit this corporation in antitrust kind of sense, that Standard Oil is getting too powerful and they're controlling prices and they're limiting the liberties of the people because they established monopolies. Not like that, but we need to limit the speech of this group that is too powerful because they're drowning out other speech that we consider to be better. That corporations are too powerful and little people are getting shut out. Well, there's no objective way of deciding how much speech various portions of society should have, or how much political influence various portions of society should have. So it seems to me that a lot of these kinds of debates about shouldn't the government get involved more because look at this group, it's too powerful, assumes a kind of baseline about how much influence different groups should have. And part of what the First Amendment does is to tell us we don't have that kind of baseline, or the baseline is the government doesn't play that kind of influence, and that whatever, if person A has more political influence than person B because person A is a better speaker, or person A spends more time on politics, or person A is more informed than person B, well, we shouldn't say that that's unfair and that we should limit person A's speech because otherwise he's going to be too powerful. We say, well, it's person A's right to speak, and person B also has the right to speak. If person B chooses not to exercise that right, or to spend his resources, his time on something else, well, then he's free to do that. Now, of course, the response to all of that is, well, you don't always start out from the same position. So person A and person B, well, person A might have inherited a ton of money, and person A might have an Ivy League education, and person A might have his uncle might be the U.S. senator, or the person might be the leader of a Fortune 500 company or whatever, and person B might just be a recent immigrant from someplace who's trying to scrape together a living and doesn't have the time to be involved in politics and doesn't have the money to do that. And yes, all that is true. And so if there have been plenty of people who disagree with that kind of economic libertarianism on the ground that it leads to inequality.
Right.
And it does. That's a difference in political philosophy is, do you care about equality so much that you're willing to clamp down on liberty? Or do you care about liberty so much that you're willing to tolerate a certain amount of inequality? And the fact is that all of us care about both of those things. We just place different amounts of emphasis on one or the other. But in philosophical terms, it seems to me that that's really what a lot of these debates are about, is where you decide to place yourself on that spectrum between liberty and equality.
But
remember, as I said before, that if you go for equality, you always have to bear in mind that some institution, somebody is going to be deciding what equality means in that context, and is going to have the power to suppress some in order to reduce the inequality that would be present if you left everybody alone.
You totally nailed the only comment I was going to make, that was literally it, was what's interesting is it is a very relevant conversation and question that is commonly brought up, the question of equality. And what I think we lose sight of when having those discussions is, what is it? Is it the equality? Is it equal opportunity, or is it equal outcome? Because we have some people who are fighting for equal opportunity, and then we have some people who are fighting for equal outcome, as if they're the same form of just the ambiguous equality conversation. And so I think you raise a really great point of, we also need to siphon out what that means. What is it we're striving for? Is it the equality of opportunity, or is it the equality of outcome? Because what is interesting, you nailed it with your person A versus person B metaphor, because you will always have some people who have more available to them than others. That's just the beauty and also the unfortunate downfall that is being in America. But also there is so much possibility for growth. That's all. I feel that that's all that society can offer, is we have the tools here. It's up to you to grab the tools and make something of it. But I could tell you, there were people in that law school that blew me out of the water and had a significantly harder life leading into law school. Just a tougher childhood, just a tougher familial background, and they blew me out of the water. So some would say, well, you juggled and tripped with your privilege. And others would say that the other person just blew it out of the water, that they stepped up to the plate and hit a home run, that they put in the work and got what they deserved out of it. They had, a lesser starting point, but they also reached greater final results because they put in the work required of it. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of equality? And then we'll move on to a better question I have for you.
I think that you're right that the different kinds of people have different talents and they expend their resources in different kinds of ways, and simply making sure that people have the same kinds of resources at any given point doesn't guarantee that they're going to do the same thing with those resources. There is, of course, a lot of disagreement and discussion about where that line is between equality of opportunity and equality of results. And there's a lot of people will say, well, I'm for equality of opportunity and not just for equality of results. And that has a lot of intuitive appeal. On the other hand, it's important to figure out, well, what goes into that opportunity? What do we mean by equalizing opportunity? Can the government, should the government try to equalize the vast amounts of inequality that we see in society? And it might be too facile an assumption to say, well, we give everybody a public school education for free. We don't overtly discriminate against anybody when we seek to hire people for jobs or go to graduate schools or to those kinds of things. And those certainly are aspects of equality of opportunity. I mean, heck, we have the agency is called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission because we think of that kind of thing as part of what goes into equal opportunity. But the fact of the matter is that it's not equality of opportunity if people aren't starting from the same point. That the person who comes from a solid family background, who has a certain amount of money, whose parents are educated and who care about educating the kids, who do those kind of things, keep the kid safe and healthy, and that person's not given the same opportunity as someone who grows up in an unsafe neighborhood with a single parent, with drugs all around, yes, you can go to a public school, but the public school doesn't teach you as much as the other public school does. And there's a lot of inequality in society that even if we say, well, we're for equality of opportunity, we're a long way from equality of opportunity among the 330 million people that are in this country.
No, that's a great response. I appreciate it. So moving forward, I just got a couple. Well, I'll keep it quick for you because I know I've taken a bit of your time here. So I am curious, how did these private networks like CNN and Fox get complete control over these debates? It seems as if these I was on the phone with someone last night and I said, I feel as if it needs to become another, I just keep adding to my list of goals I need to put in my legal career of just changes I want to make. It's all a delusional dream, but I have them. And I feel as if another position that needs to be voted on, I feel as if we should all be electing debate moderators, because instead of these CIA agents that were implanted in the media networks, they know we'll be stuck with someone like Joe Rogan doing these debates, and they surely don't want that because he'll be asking questions that actually push the points and get answers that we want to hear. So I'm just annoyed with all these moderators and the biases they have. But how do these networks get that, and why? And I guess it's a private thing, right? It's got to be that these presidents, they agree. They're the ones that come together and say we will have 3 debates on these networks. But how do we break that, if at all, or is this just another camouflage monopoly we got to swallow that pill and deal with?
Well, the Commission on Presidential Debates has a significant role to play in deciding the formats, but yes, they're subject to the agreement of the candidates who will be debating. it's really the same kind of debate that we have when we talk about the accountability of any of these other kinds of commissions or private entities. If you have a debate about how much influence any group should have relative to something else, well, a lot of those things are really important issues. Discussing who should have power is probably the key aspect of government and political theory. But if you're going to criticize something, then come up with a solution. So say, we shouldn't do it this way. This way is terrible. We should do it instead this other way. And so if you show me some kind of system for having a presidential debate that doesn't put some amount of control over speech in some group that might not be representative, it's in some ways it's an impossible problem, and it's one of the reasons why I like studying election law so much, is because we have this idea that we should choose rules that are neutral. But we're having the whole reason we're having the debate is because we're not sure on who the public will want to make decisions going forward. So we have to have somebody make decisions so that the public can choose who to make decisions in the future. And the decisions you make at time one can influence what the ultimate choice of the people is. And that's there's no way of getting around that. There are ways of minimizing the problems, and there's some choices that are better than others. But never forget, whenever you have to make any of these kinds of discussions or decisions, never forget that if you are giving someone power, that power can be misused, and that there are different kinds of influences that might be imposed on that. So if you think corporations should have more power, well, then you think about what kind of potential misuses of that corporate power are going to be, and whether we're comfortable with the changes in society that might be caused by that corporate influence. If you think government agencies should have more power because you think government agencies are populated by experts who know what they're doing, and you think that they're apolitical kinds of people, well, think about how that power can be misused and what the dangers of that are. If you think the president should have more power, if you think the courts should have more power, if you think the legislature should have more power, if you think the leadership in Congress should have more power or less relative to the other, well, any kind of power can be misused. And I think that goes back to where we started a while ago, talking about the genius of the framers was dividing power. And that if you agree that any kind of political power can be misused, then the best thing that you can do about that is make sure that no one institution has total power.
And it's strong, well-developed answers like that make me miss being in your classroom, Professor. That was incredible. I appreciate that. So
I miss having you in my classroom.
Honest to God, First Amendment class was tough. I'm telling you, it was tough showing up at 7 o'clock and leaving at 10. That was not easy, but man, if I didn't get excited, I'd be half asleep at 6 p.m., but man, when 7 o'clock would roll around, a wave of energy would come, and that answer was incredible. So that makes me excited to ask you this. What is with all these confirmation hearings? Because with my understanding, it was that there was a standard set like 20 years ago with a bad justice choice that we had a hearing, and then it became this bipartisan thing where, well, you brought ours into question, so we're going to bring yours into question, and now it's become like a precedent set that we just confirm and drag everybody's good character and name through the mud. Is this what it's going to become? Are we going to have confirmation hearings for every justice, or do we see that this might be something, do we see a possibility of kind of curbing this in the future, or is this the new normal?
Oh, a lot of people have gotten into a lot of trouble by making predictions about how politics is going to be over the course of the future. So I frankly don't know what we're going to get, but I can see the trajectory that we've been on, and it's been. I think that here's what's happened. The problem, the reason why we're in the situation where we are, is because the Supreme Court has made decisions in important areas of life that the public cares about. And that's indisputable. The Supreme Court makes decisions about abortion, the death penalty, affirmative action, criminal justice policy, prayer in schools, other aspects of religious liberty, and on and on and on. Every year, the Supreme Court makes decisions that show up in the newspaper because the public cares about what the results of those Supreme Court decisions are. Because the nomination and confirmation process is a political process, because the nomination decision is made by the president, because the confirmation decision is vested in the Senate, all politicians who are elected have to stand for re-election, particularly when the re-election is happening at the same time as or the quest for re-election is happening at the same time as the nomination goes. You see this interplay between the court process and the political process. And members of the public, the voters, and their representatives in the Senate and in the executive branch, they want to see the court populated by people who are going to see things their way. And it stands to reason that if you have Democrats in the Senate who understand that a Republican nominee for the Supreme Court is going to make it harder for them to achieve their policy agenda, they're going to oppose that nominee. And the same is vice versa. If you see a Republican nominee, or a Republican Senate viewing a Democratic nominee, that the Democratic nominee on the court is going to make it harder for the Republicans to achieve their policy goals, and so it makes sense that they'll oppose them. I think that the difference that we have now is that it used to be, prior to what seems to be a turning point is the Bork nomination in 1987, with certain exceptions since then, including the Ginsburg nomination in 1993. Those are exceptions, but the difference now, generally speaking, now from before, is that it had been the case that a Senate of the opposite party would give a certain amount of deference to the president's choice. So Nixon's elected in 68, takes office in 69, fills a couple of vacancies on the Supreme Court. And even though the Democrats gave him some pushback on some of his nominations, still they were willing to say, all right, well, we'll take a Republican that we might not be happy with because the president gets to be the one to nominate these justices, and we don't want to just keep turning everybody down and keeping vacancies on the Supreme Court forever. Nowadays, people see the stakes of Supreme Court nominations are perceived as so much higher, and that we don't want to back down. If we're a Democratic Senate, we don't want to have a conservative Republican name another justice because we see that the Supreme Court is so central to our ability to achieve our policy goals. And I think Democrats were quicker to realize that. They realized it with Robert Bork, that they did not want a conservative Republican appointment on the Supreme Court, even though it was a person who was indisputably qualified for the job. That they said, yes, he's qualified, but his policy views are so different from ours that we don't want him on the court. Democrats, I think, had that attitude years ago. Republicans did not have as much of that attitude, that they were willing to say, okay, we'll go along with Ruth Ginsburg's nomination, even though we know that she's liberal, even though we know she was appointed by President Carter to the Court of Appeals, even though we know that she had made a name as a civil rights lawyer, even though we know that she headed up the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. We'll still vote to confirm her unanimously, or virtually unanimously, because, well, President Clinton's a Democrat, and of course he's going to name a liberal justice. I don't think that we have that anymore. Still, a lot of Republicans voted in favor of Sotomayor and Kagan, and we'll see whether they continue to do that. But now we're at the point where Democrats will simply all or virtually all vote en masse against Republican nominees. That the number of no votes that very well qualified people, Roberts, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh had controversy for different reasons, and now Barrett, that the number of no's that those people will receive from Democrats is very significant. Even if they end up getting on the court, that in past years, I think that they would have been put on the court in voice votes, and if they had roll call votes, the number of yes votes would have been overwhelmingly positive, because these people are qualified, and ideologically the other party in the Senate would have given the president a significant amount of deference. Now, I don't think that's the case. Now, it's another debate about whether we think that's appropriate or not. It can certainly be argued that the current situation is in some respects healthier, because after all, the appointment power is shared between the president and the Senate. Why should the Senate lay down? If the president gets to choose nominees based in part on ideology, Reagan chose Bork in part because he's conservative, why shouldn't the Senate be able to reject him on the same ideological grounds? So so I can certainly understand the arguments that says that this is appropriate, but it certainly seems different from what it had been a generation or two before.
Definitely. Okay. So I have one last big question for you. We have our vice president comes out and tells us that we don't even deserve to know. We're not allowed to know.
Well, sir, don't the voters deserve to know? No, they don't. I'm not going to play his game.
And so I'm curious if you may be able to kind of shine some light and illuminate it and liberate us from our ignorance. What would it mean to stack the court? What result would that bring about? And I don't know if you can or can't offer it, but kind of any opinions you may have to offer on what that would result in, a good or bad or, moot. Does it make a difference, or we don't know?
The Supreme Court's been set at 9 members ever since 1869, but it is set at 8 members by statute. So there's no constitutional provision that says that the Supreme Court shall have 9 members. It's only a statute that says that the Supreme Court has 9 members. So Congress can change that by statute, just the same as it changes any other statute. So if the House and the Senate pass an amendment to that statute that says we're going to set the Supreme Court at 15 members, or pick whatever number you and the president signs that bill, then the membership of the Supreme Court changes, or the number of allotted seats for the Supreme Court changes. It would create immediately a certain number of vacancies. And the only way that you fill vacancies on the Supreme Court is to have a presidential nomination and a Senate confirmation. So it is entirely within the power of the president and Congress to set the number of Supreme Court justices at whatever number they think is wise. And this has happened before. It's happened for some partisan reasons before, but like I say, it's been set at 9 justices since 1869. Now, under the current rules of the Senate, you'd not only have to have the measure passed, but in order to pass the Senate, you'd have to get through a filibuster. There is some suggestion that if the Democrats do take control of the Senate after this November's elections, that they will do away with the legislative filibuster. So all you would need to pack the court then would be a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and if former Vice President Biden wins the presidential election, then Vice President Harris would be able to break ties in the Senate. So you wouldn't even need a majority of senators. You'd need 50 senators plus the vice president, and you need a signature by President Biden. So yes, there's no question that they would have the raw political power to do that if they take majorities in the House and Senate, and the Democrats win the presidency as well. Now, whether this is a good idea, what the consequences of that would be, what history says about it, the last time that this was tried was 1937. As I said, sometimes in the past, prior to 1869, it was tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But the most recent time, the only time in the last century when it was seriously tried, was in 1837, where President Roosevelt was unhappy with the conservative direction of the Supreme Court and wanted Congress to pass a law that would have expanded the membership on the court and would have allowed him to make 6 appointments, would have increased the membership of the court to 15. And the public didn't like it. The public thought that the independence of the Supreme Court was too valuable, and that this method of packing the court, even though it was constitutional, still was an unacceptable interference with the independence of the Supreme Court. And this is a public that had just, in 1936, overwhelmingly reelected President Roosevelt, overwhelmingly returned Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, and still the public said, this would go too far, that undermining the independence of the Supreme Court would go too far. So the measure was so unpopular that it never got out of Congress. And so the membership of the court has stayed at 9. Now, whether we're in a different time, whether the Democrats and other liberals are so upset that they're going to be willing to make a run at this, who knows? Now, it's worth mentioning that even though Roosevelt was unsuccessful in getting the Supreme Court's membership to change in terms of the numbers of justices, that pretty soon after the court packing plan failed, there started being retirements and other vacancies from the Supreme Court. So Roosevelt he was able to make 9 appointments to the Supreme Court over the next 8 years or so after then, but not because Congress increased the number of justices, just because of the brevity of the lifespan of the justices who were on the court already.
Wow.
So in terms of constitutional law, the direction of the Supreme Court changed radically after 1937. It went from being a conservative Supreme Court prior to that to accepting the constitutionality of the New Deal and all kinds of economic regulations of the states as well at the time. So the direction of the Supreme Court changed markedly. And over the long term, appointments to the Supreme Court can have that effect. You can show that the ideological direction of the Supreme Court can change with appointments. But if you try to do it quickly through expanding the Supreme Court's membership, you might have a political problem getting that through to the voters. They might, at least they did in 1937, perceived that as too much of an overstep.
But I think your answer is so strong in that, a utilitarian like me has to swallow the pill of, it should boil down to public opinion. If the resounding majority says we want more justices, but again, the sad part is, Professor, I really do think us as a society, we are just getting dumber. I think we as law students and law professors get the fortunate delusion of being in the bubble of smart people that we slowly lose touch with how the overwhelming majority of how many people are dumb. And I know putting it in such blunt terms is kind of aggressive and not, fanciful, but also the tough part is I feel as if we projected the question to your constitutional law classroom of 100 academics, we could come out up with a really great response and a productive response for society. But when we go, hey, mechanic, what do you think about that? It's not that I don't think the mechanic is capable of coming up with a decision. I feel as if everybody wants a political opinion without having to do the political homework. The amount of people that don't sit there and watch their representatives in committee hearings or in these meetings, congressional meetings, it's like it's live on Twitter, folks. You could check it out any day on Twitter. You log on, there's something new live that Congress is doing, but nobody does it. We all have opinions without having to do the homework. And so what I think stinks is, the utilitarian in me goes, yeah, it should be left up to the public. And if this is what the public wants, then that is the pill you swallow. But also, I'm starting to lose faith in the public. I feel as if we might be a little ill-informed, and the majority of the people aren't as reliable in terms of what's best for us as a community.
The problem with constitutional law has always been that the constitutional rights that we have are meant to be protected from the majority. So if we take too majoritarian approach to constitutional law, it says, well, the public wants this, the public should get that. Don't we live in a democracy? If you take too much of that approach, then you lose the protections of constitutional law. You say, well, no, we have this constitution to limit the influence of democracy, to say that you may have more votes, but you still can't interfere with these rights. You can't change the Constitution because I should be able to depend on these, even if my position is unpopular. On the other hand, if you give too much power that way, if you say, oh, well, no, the Supreme Court gets to decide on the liberties of the people, then you say, well, aren't we then creating a kind of rule by oligarchy, that we've just appointed these people as the ones to decide what rules our society should live by, and have we limited democracy too much? Again, it's that kind of balance. Everybody agrees with both sides of the problem, and coming up with where that balance point is what often involves the debate.
Oh, that was a great way to end it, Professor. I love that. You're so right. And it is a delicate balance, but that's what makes it an exercise, baby, is you got to do the balancing. We got to do the work, or else we're not going to get the desired result. So I appreciate that. Professor, I appreciate you coming on. If there's anything you'd like to promote, please do. I don't know if you have a website or anything to kind of drum up support. We could send people there, but if not.
No, I have my regular Widener website, and the book that I have coming out in another couple of weeks is going to be of interest mostly to people who are taking courses in election law. I did have a book that I co-edited that came out a few weeks ago from Cambridge University Press that's on reforming the presidential nomination process. It's called The Best Candidate. And the two editors, I'm the second editor. The first editor is a colleague of mine named Eugene Mazo, M-A-Z-O. And that book is now available. So thank you for the opportunity to mention that to your viewers.
Please, I might have to read it. And Professor, I might try to instigate you to come on, and we might be able to talk about your book. And what stinks is I got the bar in February, so time is like a feegle. It's just sand falling through my fingers. But I just keep adding to my list. Just put it on the tab. I'll get it done at some point. But I'd love to go over it sometime. So again, thank you for coming on. I know a lot of kids from school watch this, and a lot of my friends from back home will also just appreciate the productive conversation. So thank you for kind of keeping my craziness in. Sometimes you got to correct the biases we have, but also, I think you really and also, Professor, I've got like 7 more questions I'd love to ask you, but so if you don't mind, I'd love to get you on again. But thank you so much for your time and allowing just the freedom of me kind of bouncing off some ideas off of you, and giving me the chance to grow. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, of course. So guys, as we wrap up here, go check out our website, rethinktankpodcast.com. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and we'll catch you next time, guys. Thanks. Peace.